Let's see how we'd include some CSS on our page to help style and change the appearance of our content. I'll start by creating a new folder for this project. I'll also add an index.html page and a main CSS file. Let's open this up in Sublime Text. I'll fill our HTML page with the boilerplate. Now that we have the boilerplate defined, let's look at a couple different ways that we can actually include CSS on our page. One way that we can include CSS is by doing it inline. With some basic HTML here, I can add a style attribute to this paragraph tag and give it some color. Here I've decided to give this paragraph a bit of red color to make it appear more bold. And now we have a red paragraph. It's important to note that this is not ideal for our HTML because of separation of concerns. We want to make sure that our HTML stays in our HTML pages, that our CSS stays in our CSS documents, and that our JavaScript stays in our JavaScript documents to keep everything separated. It's a lot clearer when you're working with more content and more files. Another way to include CSS on our page is to use the style tag. Normally this is defined in the head of your document. We'll also specify a type to tell the browser what type of content is in this tag. Here we'll define rule sets as we would in normal CSS, not like the style tag, not like the style attribute. The first step will be to define a selector. Let's say we want to change all of our paragraphs to red. We use the curly brackets to denote the body of our rule set and define rules within that set. This selector will select all paragraph tags. Let's define a rule that changes the color of all the paragraphs to red. Our paragraph is turned red. We can also see in our style set that color red has been attached to the paragraph. If I add another paragraph, we'll be able to see that this is now applied to all the paragraphs on our page. Now both paragraphs match the selector and are given the rule set. This is also not ideal because it still doesn't fit our separation of concerns issue. we're still defining CSS within our HTML file. The best way to include CSS is to use an external document, like the one that we created here, main CSS. In order to do this, we'll need to use a link tag to include main.css as part of the load process for our page. Link tags go in the head of the document. We're also defining a series of attributes. This tells the browser that it's a style sheet. This tells the browser that the content is text or CSS. The final attribute is similar to the source tag of our image. It defines where the CSS file is located. In this case, we'll be using main.css since it's relative to index.html. Now that we've linked the file, knowing that there's no content in it, let's make sure that our HTML page is actually loading in the file. In order to do this, I'll check to make sure that we haven't received any errors in our console, which it looks like we aren't, and then I'll check our network tab. Here we can see that two files have been loaded. The first is our HTML, and the second is our CSS file. Both were successful. If they weren't, they'd be outlined in red. Cool, so now that our file's actually being loaded, let's add some CSS to the file. I'll open the file and add a rule set. Let's set the selector to all paragraph tags, and in the body we'll define color red. And here we can see, just like we did with the style element inside of our header, we've attached the color red to all paragraph tags on our page. The first important part of any rule set is the selector. This is how the browser decides what the rules are applied to. So far we've just done the element selector, but let's look at some different ways that we can access content on our page. Here's our element selector. This will allow us to select all elements that have the P tag. We can apply a rule set to multiple elements if we'd like to by using a comma. Let's say we want to add a rule to all paragraph tags and all of our strong tags. We'll use the comma to separate our selectors, and this will find all paragraph tags and all strong tags. We can also use the descendant selector to select all elements contained within an element. The descendant selector allows us to be more specific about which elements we want to talk about. Let's say that we only want to select our anchor tags that exist within a paragraph tag. For this, we'll start with our paragraph, so this will select all paragraphs on the page. Then we'll use the space to define a separator. This will look for all of our next element within the paragraphs. Here we'll find all paragraphs, and then within that result set we'll find all anchor tags, and then we can apply a rule specifically to those. So we've looked at the element selector so far and different ways that we can combine selectors to select multiple elements or descendants of elements. But let's see how we can access the ID and class attributes that we set in our HTML. The ID selector allows us to select any HTML element that contains the matching ID. We'll use the hashtag or the # to specify that we're looking for an ID. This will find any element that contains the ID, myElementID. For classes, it's very similar, but we'll use the dot instead of that pound sign to define our selector. Here we'll find all elements that contain the class myElementClass. We can be even more specific about which element we want by combining our tags without using a space. Let's say that we want to select all paragraph tags that have the class myClass. We'll start with our paragraph tag selector, and then by not putting in a space, we'll also include the class that we want. Here we're saying we want all paragraph tags that also have the myElementClass defined. Most CSS is about selecting elements on our page. Pseudo-selectors allow us to select a state of an element, like hover. Here we have a basic HTML page with an anchor tag that navigates to google.com. Let's add a hover rule so that when the user hovers over this link, the color changes. First, I'll select all anchor tags using A, and I'll give it a base style. Next, I'll use the pseudo-selector hover to select the hover state, or when the mouse is hovering over the element, to change the color. This is done by using the selector that we want to use, then using colon and the state that we want to select. So this will select all tags, all A tags, in the hover state. I'll change the color to orange on hover. Let's see what this looks like. Here we have our google.com link, which starts as green, and when I hover, the color changes to orange. An easy way to test state changes with our CSS in the developer tools is to actually right-click on our element, choose Force Element State, and set it to hover. Here we can see that the new rule, A hover, has overridden the default A color. Note that both rules are still applying. So for instance, if I wanted to turn off the text decoration, this underline, for both the default state and the hover state, I only have to apply it to the default state. Here I'll add the rule for text decoration and set it to none. Note that I don't have to also put it in our hover pseudo-selector. Reloading the page shows that the underline is gone, and when I hover, the underline is still gone, even though the color is changing. Let's see what this looks like in the Style tab. I'll force the element state to hover, and we can see that color is being overridden, but text decoration stays. Let's take a look at some basic CSS rules that we can use in our projects. I've opened up First CSS, and we'll take a look at each rule individually to see how it works. The text decoration rule allows us to set an overline, underline, or a strike through on our text. Here we can see the underline style. The overline style, and the line through style. When using links, they receive a default underline style. So we can specifically target links and set their text decoration to none. to remove this default behavior. Width and height will allow us to force a size for one of our elements. We'll start with a basic div. With some content inside. I'll give this div an ID so that we can uniquely identify it in our CSS. I'll open this file by right-clicking and choosing Open in Browser. And here we can see we have our Hello World printed to the screen. As I open the developer tools and highlight this element, we can see that it receives some formatting from the browser. By default, the browser makes divs block level elements. Block level elements will fill the width of the screen. Our body comes with some basic margin, so that's why we're seeing that this div does not fill the screen. In order to see width as we're working in the browser, I'll add to the element style here just to test. Let's see what happens if we change the width of this element. In my CSS file, I'll target the div, and I'll add a width rule. I'll set the width to 50 pixels for now. Saving the file and refreshing our page, we'll see that Hello World has now moved to 2 lines, and our rule of 50 pixels has applied. The margin here is automatically calculated based on the width that we've supplied. Now let's edit the height of this element. I've reset our CSS so that there are no rules applied to Hello World, and we can see that the calculated height of our element is 18 pixels. This is calculated based on the font size. I'm also zoomed in on the page so it seems a little bit larger. Changing the height of this element to 100 pixels and refreshing the page doesn't look like it changed anything. We can see that our rule is applied here, but when I mouse over this element we can see that the new height is 100 pixels regardless of the content size. This is because both width and height are automatically calculated based on the core browser rules as well as the content of the element. When we force a height or a width, we're actually overriding the default browser behavior. The color rule allows us to override the default coloring of an item at the text level. By default, our text is black. Let's make it red. And now our color is red. The background property allows us to set the color and even images as a background to an element. Let's say I want the Hello World div to have a specific background color. I can set background to red, and reloading the page we'll see that this div now has a background of red. I've downloaded a background.png file so that we can set a background on this element as an image. In order to set an image, I'll use the URL property. I'll set it to my background. And let's see what this looks like. Here we can see the background has been set and is filling the content. Let's change this so it applies to the body of our document. I'll change my selector to body, save, and reload the page. And we can see that it fills the content. If we want to control this background image a little more, we can add properties like no repeat, which will prevent our image from tiling. The border property allows us to set a border on our element. We'll specify it by setting the width of each border, the style, and the color. Refreshing our page shows that our div has been outlined by a red solid border 1 pixel wide. Increasing the width property will give us a thicker border. And the style type property allows us to change what the border looks like. Based on the box model, padding allows us to specify some distance between the border and the content. Let's add a border so we can see what this looks like. I'll add a 1 pixel solid black border to our Hello World div. Now let's add some padding. Add a 20 pixel padding all the way around our element. This gives our content a little bit of breathing room while still being contained inside of the border. Let's add a background color to see what that looks like. Add a light gray background. As we can see, the border contains the background, which contains the padding, which contains the content. Mousing over our div will show that our border is outside with a large green box containing a smaller blue box, where blue is the content, green is the padding, the outer outline is the border. Padding, as with many rules, can be defined in different ways. This version will set the padding all the way around. This version will set the padding for the top and bottom, and then the left and right. Let's see what that looks like. Here we can see we have a smaller vertical padding and a larger horizontal padding. The final version allows us to specify each set individually. This format follows the top, right, bottom, left format. Mousing over this item shows an increasing padding starting from the top and going clockwise around to the left. Margin is a bit like padding, but it sits on the outside of our element. With padding, we saw that as we added padding, the content was pushed around, and the background and the border were contained. Let's add some margin to our Hello World div. Margin is defined in a similar way to padding, where we can specify all, top, bottom, and left, right, or top, right, bottom, and left. Let's start by adding 20 pixels all the way around our div. Here we can see the content is pushed in, but the border and the content remain the same size. Mousing over this div will show a larger orange border around our element, which will push away any other elements nearby. Block level elements take up the full width of the page. Let's take a look at a couple paragraph tags. By default, paragraphs are block level elements. I've created 2 paragraphs, so let's see what this looks like in the browser. Here we can see that both paragraphs, even though the content doesn't fill the full width, have filled their space. They've also been given some default margin by the browser. This separates them a little bit. By default, text itself is in line. Let's create a paragraph tag, our block level element, and put some text inside. I'll also add an anchor tag. Anchor tags in text are by default inline elements. Let's see what this looks like. Here, we have our paragraph tag, which is a block level element, and inside we have our text, which is inline, and our anchor tag, which is inline. This allows the text to flow like it might in a text editor. If I add more text after the link, this will flow as well. I've added some text after the link, and we can see that it flows normally. Let's say we have some default block level elements that we actually want to appear in line. I'll start by creating a UL with a series of LI elements. By default, the browser puts these stacked vertically. Technically, they're block level elements. But let's say we want it to appear side by side. In order to control this, I can use the CSS property of display to change how they look. I'll target all of my LIs with the selector, and then in the rule set, I'll add display, and I'll set their display to be inline. Now we can see that they've stacked horizontally and are acting as though they are inline elements. The problem is that with inline elements, they are at the browser's mercy for flow. So let's say that we want to change the height of these elements. I'll set the height to 40 pixels and refresh the page. Inspecting our LIs show that they've still received the default size of 18 pixels, even though I've specified a height of 40 pixels. This is due to the default inline styling. Fortunately, we have a display type that merges the best of both worlds, and this is the inline block display. Let's change our display to inline-block and allow the browser to treat these as block level elements that are still in line. Here we can see that even though they're still stacked horizontally, they did receive the actual height that we specified. Let's add a couple more items to see how this looks when it gets down to 2 lines. I've added 2 more list items to see if this will go to the next line. And there we go. This is wrapped as usual, since they're technically inline elements. But we can see that each element still keeps in touch with the height that we've passed it. If we have a series of block level elements that we want to stack side by side, but we don't want them to be in line, and we want a little more control over how they're laid out, we can use the float property. I'll create 2 divs, float one left, and then float one right. I've created these divs, but I haven't specified any class rule sets in my style sheet. So let's see what the default looks like. Here we have normal behavior for 2 block level divs. Let's add some floating. In my CSS file, I'll target my pull left class and set the float property to left. Next, I'll target my pull right selector and set the float property to right. Let's see what this looks like. So it's taken our left div, collapsed its width to be automatic based on the content, so now we can see that it's 96 pixels instead of the 100% it used to be, and it's stuck it to the left. It's also broken the default flow of our page and taken our right div and thrown it to the right of the page. Now these styles could be achieved by other rules, so let's see what this actually does to the flow of the page. In order to see how the flow is affected, I'll add a basic inline span tag and fill it with some placeholder text. So here I've created the basic span tag and filled it with some lorem ipsum text. Let's note the changes that happen when I refresh the page. Left is still positioned to the left and right is still positioned to the right. And when I reload the page, we can see that our span tag has now flowed around our floated elements. So here we have our floated left element. Here we have our floated right element. And around it, we actually have our span tag. This is effective if we want to have text flow around an image, or maybe a description. Increasing the height of either of these floated elements will also affect the text around it. Let's increase the height of our right floated element. I've set the height of pull right to 50 pixels. And here we can see that the text has flowed around where the element is. Looking at our floated example, let's say that we want our span tag not to float around this content. Let's say that we want our span tag not to take into account these two floated items. This can be done using the clear property. First, I'll add a class to my span. I'll call it clear for clarity's sake. In my CSS, I'll add a rule for our clear selector. Span tags by default are non-block level elements. So in order for this to work, we'll need to be able to control its layout a bit. Let's set its display type to block. And now let's add a clear property. Let's set it to left and see what that does. Refreshing the page shows that our cleared element now sits below our left floated element, but still takes into account our right floated element. Setting this to right allows it to clear past our right element. This is the inverse of what we just saw by clearing left. However, because the right element is taller than our left element, this content never wraps around the left content. We can also change this to clear both so that all floats above it will be cleared before the content is laid out. Display block, display inline, and display inline block, as well as float left and float right, are a couple ways that we can control the layout of our page. We also have some more advanced ways to do this, using positioning. This allows us to specify exactly where on a page or in the viewport our content will appear. First, let's look at position relative. I'll create a div and then use position relative to adjust its actual position on the page. I've created a basic div with some basic content. I'll add a couple styles so we can see what this looks like. Here I've given it a padding of 10 pixels, a solid black border, and a light gray background. In our page, we can see this is slightly positioned off the top left. This is because I'm not using normalize to clear that padding. And we have some layout on our content. It's also filling the entire page. This means other content will flow below it as it's rendered. Let's see what happens when we set this to position relative. I've set the position to relative. Reloading the page shows that nothing actually changes. This is because position relative doesn't actually remove our element from the normal content flow. What it does allow us to do is specify top, left, bottom, and right values in order to adjust where this content will appear. Let's say that we want this to appear 10 pixels above where it actually is. Here I'll set the top to -10 pixels, and we can see that it's been pulled up above the page. Mousing over it shows exactly where it is. Position relative is slightly unique though. Let's take a look at a more complicated example. I've added 2 span tags around my div so that we can see what our layout would look like. When I refresh the page, we can see that our box now sits on top of our first content, but our second content still flows normally. So here's where our first content is, and here's where our second content is. This is because the browser still renders the div itself where it's supposed to be. It takes in the same amount of size and the same amount of content, but actually renders its visuals based on the top and left and right and bottom properties that we specify. For instance, if I change the property that's changing the position of this element, this div, let's see what changes. Here I'm going to change the bottom property to be -10 pixels. This will pull it 10 pixels away from the center of the content. I'm now just specifying bottom, it will move the whole content. Refreshing the page, we can see that this is moved down, but neither of our first content or second content have changed their position. When working with positioning, you really only want to use position relative to help set context for position absolute, which we'll look at next. You can also use it for minor offsets for content, but you don't want to use it to move your content, say, 100 pixels down the page, because it will give you weird results of your layout. If I change this value to 100 pixels, it's hard to tell what's going on here. This is just a big empty space, even though our content is now currently down here. So you want to avoid using position relative for this sort of content change. Position absolute allows us to specify exactly where our content is going to be displayed based on a context, which currently is the document. So let's see what that looks like. The other thing to note is that position absolute will remove this element from our layout, unlike position relative. In my CSS rule set, I'll add a rule for position absolute. Note that I haven't specified any actual positioning, just the rule type that I want to use. It's pulled this block level element out of the normal flow, set its width to automatic, and allowed this span tag to be in line with this span tag. So already our layout has been changed, but we'll see that the position of this element is actually technically where it should still be. So let's set the top and left properties to see where that places this content. I'll set the top to 0 pixels and the left to 0 pixels. This pulls our content to the exact top left of our page. It's also been displayed on top of this other content. This is because it's been pulled out of the normal flow. There's still normal flow within the positioned absolute element, So this content will still be in line, but the element itself has been pulled out of the normal flow that it sits within. We can also use the right value to move this to the right side of the page. Here I've changed from left to right, still setting 0 pixels. Now our content is on the right side of the page. I'm going to reset our styles so that we can see how relative will affect the layout of our content. I'm going to change this selector and update my HTML to talk about relative and absolute, just so we can see what these do. So in my main content, I'll set this div to have the class of relative, and here I'll wrap this content in the absolute positioning. So now I have a relative container with an absolute element inside. These are arbitrary classes, so this isn't going to make anything magical happen. So let's just see what this looks like based on our CSS rule set that only sets a padding, border, and background of our relative div. So this looks about the same as what we had before. Let's add some additional styles so we can tell the two apart. Here I've added 10 pixels to our absolute element, 10 pixel padding, a 1 pixel red border, and a white background. This pushes our content around a bit by adding a bit more spacing to this element. Now let's set our absolute element inside, the absolute class, to be positioned absolute at the top left of 0. I'll add position absolute, and I'll set the top and left to 0. Since 0 is the same regardless of what element type it is, I can just put 0 here. Refreshing our page pulls it out of the layout so we can see that our container div is now collapsed and now contains only the padding, and our absolute element is now positioned to the top left of the page. This is exactly how we set it up in the previous example. But let's say that we want to use this gray div as our positioning target, as our context for the absolute. Because it contains our absolute element, we can use position relative to set up an additional context for this item. If all I do is add position relative to our relative classed item, the browser will use this as the new context. Refreshing our page pulls our element to the top left of the container item. Absolute positioning will use the top, left, right, and bottom properties as relational sets based on hierarchy. It will go up the tree until it finds the next position relative element, and it will use that. If it doesn't find an element that has position relative, it will use the whole document. So that's why we were able to see our element at the very top left of the page before we added position relative to our relative class. It's also important to note that position absolute contains that same hierarchical structure as position relative, which means if we add another position absolute element inside of a position absolute element, it will use this as a context. I've added another div of class absolute within our class absolute here. What I'm also going to do is adjust this class so that it will use the right side of our content instead of the top left, so that we can see that it's actually using a different layout. I'll create the absolute right class. Here we can see our absolute right class has a padding of 10 pixels, a border of green, and a background of a light gray. And I'll set this position absolute. Give it a right value of 0 and a bottom value of 0. So in our HTML we have a relative parent with an absolute child that also contains an absolute right child. In our CSS, we have a relative rule that just adds some styling so we can tell these items apart and sets the relative class to position relative. We then set our absolute class to position absolute with a top and left of 0, and we set our absolute right class to a position absolute right and bottom 0. When I refresh the page, we can see that our top absolute element is using the top left of our relative element, and our inner absolute element is using the bottom right of our second absolute element, regular absolute. This can get a little bit confusing, so it's worth taking some time to mess around with seeing how these different layouts will affect your content. Another layout property we have is the position fixed property. Fixed is a bit like absolute, but it uses the actual viewport as its layout context. My basic HTML here is including the span in a div that says here's some fixed content, as well as a second span so we can see what the layout changes to. I'm going to add a style for our div and give it some padding and background color so that we can set it apart from the others. Our div now has a style of padding 10 pixels, border 1 pixel solid black, and a light gray background. We can see that this looks as normal, and our flow puts the block element in between the two spans. Let's add position fixed to our fixed content div. All I've done is added position fixed, and let's see what this looks like. So here we can see that it stayed in the same place. This is a bit like what happened when we set it as absolute. Let's see what happens when we set a top and left. Here I've set it position fixed with a top 0 and a left 0. And just like absolute, it sits at the top of our page. But let's see what this looks like when I actually increase the amount of content on the page. Here I've added a new paragraph tag with some basic placeholder text inside to increase the height of our page. So nothing really changed here. But as I scroll down through the page, we'll see that our fixed element sits in the top left of our viewport, overlaying the content, but still being positioned in the top left. Let's see what happens if I change this to absolute and see what this does for our scrolling layout. In the CSS, I'll change this to absolute, And reloading the page shows no change until I start to scroll. Here, absolute is using the content of the document as its positioning context, versus fixed, which is using the viewport, the window with what we can see, as its positioning context. This is useful for sticky navigations, like main navigations that will be at the top of the page, and that stay with the user as they scroll through content. As with absolute and relative, fixed also sets a context for its own contents as well, so we can position things absolutely inside of a fixed content item. Let's take a look at some of the different centering techniques available to us through CSS. Centering can sometimes be difficult with elements because of the way that the browser renders things. This is especially apparent in vertical centering. Let's first take a look at simple text centering. I'll create a paragraph tag with some placeholder text and center the text on the page. Now that I've created this paragraph, let's load this up in the browser and see what it looks like. By default, text is aligned to the left, so let's change this alignment using CSS. In my CSS file, add a rule set for paragraph tags and set the text align property to center. Refreshing my page shows that the content is now center aligned. This works best with inline elements. So let's look at an example where we have some inline block elements that will center on the screen. Let's pretend that we're creating a main navigation. Here I've created a div with a class of navigation, filled it with a UL that contains 3 navigation items. Our page looks like this. Next, I'll do some styling changes to make the navigation items appear side by side. First, I'll set the list style type to none. And I'll remove all padding and margin from the UL. Next, I'll set the LIs to be display inline block. Now our navigation items sit side by side. I'll add a little padding and an underline so that we can see these separated. I've added a little bit of padding, a little margin, and a small border bottom to each item. Our navigation is looking pretty nice, but now let's try and get this centered. I'll target my navigation item and set the text align to center. Refreshing the page will move these items to the center of the page. As I scale it, they'll attempt to stay centered on the page. This type of centering is useful for inline elements, but let's say that we have a block level element that we want centered on the page. We can use a special technique using margin as long as we know the width of the content. I'll clear my content out and change this class to main. Let's pretend that we're centering some main content here. Remove all my styles, and I'll add some basic content to main. Here we can see that our main content is a div with class of main that contains an h1 and a paragraph tag with some placeholder content. Refreshing the page shows the content, but it's all left aligned and it's not really optimized for this screen size. Let's add some styles to make this look like a real page. In my CSS, I'll add a background color to the body. And then I'll add a background to our main element. I'll also set a width on our main element. Okay, we can see the content separated here. But I want this block to be centered. I can do this easily by, on my main element, adding a margin left and right of auto. In this case, I'll set them separately. The browser will attempt to calculate the margin left and margin right based on the container and the element that we're setting a width on. Refreshing the page shows that the content is now centered, and as I scale, the content attempts to stay in the center. Vertical centering can be a little bit tougher than horizontal centering because of the way content is calculated. Let's take a look at a couple simple examples of how to vertically center some content. With inline elements, we can use a vertical align property to make them align with each other. Let's add some inline elements and try vertically aligning them. I've created a paragraph element with 2 images and some inline text. Let's see what the default looks like. By default, it looks like it's aligning all the text and images to the bottom. So let's change that. In order for vertical align to work, we need to target the individual elements that will be receiving the vertically aligned content. I'll select my P tag, and then I'll use the star selector, which normally you don't want to use, but in this case for the demo, because I have some different content, I'll be using it. This will select all elements that exist within this content at any level. So be wary when using the star selector. I'll set the vertical align property to middle. And here we can see that inside of the container, because our 100 by 100 image is the largest, everything else aligns vertically centered to that content. This element is defining what the center is. If we increase the height of the paragraph, we should be able to adjust this amount. Let's look at a more complicated example where we have 2 divs nested inside of each other. In this case, I want the inner div to be vertically centered within the outer div. On my outer element, I'll add some styles, and on my inner element, I'll add some styles so that we can see the differentiation. Let's take a look at what this looks like by default. So here you can see by default we've got the 2 divs stacked on top of each other. So we're not seeing the container div. Let's add some height to that container. I'll adjust this to 300 so we can see it better. There we go. Now I want this div to be centered within this content. There's no easy way to do this. So what we're going to do is take advantage of how CSS exposes some table properties. Tables have this sort of centering functionality, so we're going to take advantage of that. First, we'll set our outer element to use display table. This will force the outer element to render as if it was a table. Then we'll set our inner element to display table cell and set its vertical align property to middle. By faking the positioning of both of these elements, the browser will read the outer element as a table and the inner element as a cell within that table. By setting the vertical align property to middle, this will allow us to vertically center block level elements within each other. Now by setting it to the table view, we actually need to set a width on our container. So let's do that now. In refreshing the content, we can see that our content has been scaled to fill the entire container. So this is how table cell actually works. By setting the vertical align property on a table cell, all the content inside will be vertically aligned. But by having it be table cell, the container is filled by the content. We can also set text align center if we want to horizontally center this as well. And there we have a horizontally and vertically centered element within a container. One of the problems that we have as developers for the web, and we'll get more into this in the responsive videos, is that different browsers render the content differently. Looking at a site in Chrome on a Mac may be even different from looking at a site on Chrome on a Windows PC. Or maybe looking at a site on Firefox is different than looking at it on Opera. With the different versions of different browsers on different machines, it's very difficult to tell how a browser is actually going to render the content when we put it on the page. So fortunately, we have access to a couple different types of CSS solutions for this problem. The first are reset files. Reset files will essentially take all of the default browser styles in all browsers and set them down to the basic style. This will make all of your headers 12 pixels or all of your colors black. Everything will be set back down to 0. We'll be making use of normalized CSS. This attempts to maintain a similar style for all elements without resetting them. We'll be using a CDN, or Content Delivery Network, to retrieve our normalized CSS file. For normalize, we'll be using cdnjs.com. A CDN is basically a site that is built for serving content to multiple users. They'll have different servers in different locations to help make the transfers faster. We also benefit from built-in browser caching if another site has used the same file and then they navigate to our site. That file will be cached. So let's pull down normalize by searching for normalize and copying this URL. In my HTML page at the top, I'll add a link and target our copied URL. Here I'll paste in the URL, and then I'll end my link tag. It's important to note that the reason that they don't pass HTTP or HTTPS is that the browser will default to figuring out which protocol your site is using. In this case, because we're on the file protocol, which we can see by looking at the URL in our page, this URL will attempt to read file://cdnjs.cloudflare.com, which is not what we want. So when we pull in a URL from a CDN, we want to make sure that if we're on the local file system, we specify HTTP. So here I'll add http:// to the beginning of that URL. Now by default, our page looks like this. We have some extra margins, everything is in a sans serif font, our links are set up a certain way. This is just an H1 with a couple paragraph tags and a link tag. Refreshing this page with the new normalized CSS file changes the style slightly. We're now using a sans serif font. We can see that the margin has been normalized, and this basically means that everything in this page should look very, very similar in other browsers at different versions. If you're interested in what styles are actually being applied here, you can take a look at the CSS file that's been loaded. I'll open up my dev tools, open up the head element, right-click on that URL, and open the link in a new tab. And here we can see a bunch of rules that have been applied. This covers a lot of things like tables and inputs. Overall, it's a good idea to include this file with your projects so that you can at least take a first crack at making sure that your page looks good on all browsers. Sometimes controlling block formatting context can be difficult if the content is hard to control. Let's take a look at an example of using a clear fix. You'll probably come across this often in your development days, but a clear fix is a way to force a container to clear its children instead of having to control how that is done manually. In this case, let's try floating these three boxes here to the left to see what happens. In my HTML, I have a container with the three boxes inside and a footer below. My CSS simply defines background colors for the container and the boxes. We can't see the background for the container because the boxes are hiding it. Let's float our boxes left. Refreshing the page shows us a similar situation that we encountered when using block formatting context, where our boxes are now floated to the left and our content in our footer is actually wrapping up above to go in line with our content. Now one thing we can do is we can use overflow hidden on the container to force this to be fixed. Let's just see what that looks like now. I've added overflow hidden to the container. This will force the container to recalculate its sizing. Here we can see it's filled itself out, we can see the green background, and our footer is displaying properly. Now this works well, but with overflow hidden, there's a side effect of content being hidden if we set a height. If I say that the height of my container is 10 pixels, we're going to cut off some of our content, and this is usually unintended behavior. So let's change this up and use a clear fix. I'll remove the height and overflow and add the clear fix to our container. We'll be taking advantage of the after pseudo selector and some parts of block formatting context to make this work. I'll select my container and use the after pseudo selector to create an element after this current container. I'll set its content to an empty string so that it will display. I'll set its display to table, and I'll tell it to clear both. Clear both will clear both left and right floats. This will force the container to clear its own children. Let's see what this looks like. Here we can see, without overflow hidden on our container, we get the same behavior. So by adding the after pseudo selector to our container object, setting its content to empty, forcing it to be a display table, and clearing all floats, this will force the element to contain its own children and allow any subsequent elements to take that into account. In CSS, understanding how floats work can be a complicated procedure. There's a term called block formatting context. which defines how the browser actually controls and contains floats. You can read more about the block formatting context in some of the related resources, but the general idea is that a block formatting context is how floats are contained. Let's take a look at some examples of how this applies and how we can actually start to control where floats end and begin. I'll start by creating two boxes in our layout, a left box and a right box. Next, I'll float the left box, and let's see how this affects our layout. I'll also add some background colors so we can see how this looks. Let's load up the page and see what happens. By floating our left box, we've forced it to align some content. But what's interesting is that even though our purple box here, the right box, is not floated at all, it is now side by side with our left box. Let's change a couple things so we can see this clearer. First, I'll set the width of our left box to 50%. Now we can see it's pushing the content even further. But let's take a look at what's really happening here. If I increase the height of my right box to be a little bit taller, let's say 100 pixels, you'll notice that the box actually is much larger than it appears. And to go even farther, if I change the background of the left box to be slightly transparent by using RGBA, we'll see that the purple is actually behind it. So here I'm setting it to a color with a 50% opacity. And we can see that there's purple behind it. If I add more text to the right box, it will wrap to the next line. Here I've filled the right box with some placeholder text. And there we can see that the content is flowing. Because I've set the height to 50 pixels and haven't overflowed the content, we can still see it going past the bottom line. But the key here is this floated context. Sometimes this is intended, for instance if we want text to wrap around an image. But sometimes we want our left box and our right box to be completely separate. We'll take advantage of the block formatting context by forcing an overflow hidden on our right box. By adding overflow hidden without setting a width, and I can even remove the height, let's see how our content changes. Here we can see our floated content on the left is fully breaking in the middle, while our content on the right has now been fully contained. This is because the context has been specified as the left line of this content, and therefore everything inside must match that level. We can now float things in both a left and right column to make this work. This also works with both left and right floats. Let's try adding a right column and setting our content to be displayed in the middle. In our page, I'll modify our code a little bit. I'll change our placeholder text to be our middle box, and I'll add a new right box. So we have our left box, our right box, and our middle box. In main CSS, I'll change this code to match our middle box since we've changed that around, and I'll add another rule for our right box. I'll have this one float right and give it a width of 100 pixels. I'll modify the width of my left box to also be 100 pixels. And I'll change the background of both elements. Okay, let's see what our content looks like. Here we can see we have a fluid width center column with fixed width left and right columns. If I scale this window, we'll see that this is maintained. This is because we've added a block formatting context to our center content, which forces it to contain all of its contents and not allow them to spill out into either side. So in essence, using the block formatting context allows us to control our floats in the page. Because the floats allow the browser to render content differently than it normally does, using these block formatting contexts allows us to rein in control of how the browser actually handles this content. Coupling this with clear and overflow hidden, we have a lot of control with just some simple CSS rules.